For being here this morning. My name is Carla Lima and I will be the moderator for this panel. A few words about logistics while everybody else is joining. Please note that this meeting is going to be recorded or is being recorded actually. And remember to mute your phone or computer during the presentations. I will start by introducing our panelists. Next, I will turn it over to them and they will be presenting 15 minutes each. And finally, we will have the Q&A section. Questions are welcome from the participants and also from the panelists. Today, we are pleased to welcome Marissa Knaak, William Parkhurst, Ankita Sharma, and Edward Ortiz Valencia, our presenters of the panel, Future Directions of Work and Radicalism. Let me introduce them in the order that they will be presenting. Our first panelist is Marissa Knaak. Marissa is a PhD student at Michigan State University in the History Department. Her research focuses on gender history in modern Europe, specifically related to women's relationship to socialist and labor organizations in the 19th century. Marissa will be sharing with us her work titled Consistent Radicalism, Lucy Parsons' Anarchism. Our second panelist is William Parkhurst. William is a PhD student at the University of South Florida and residential research fellow at the Leo Baeck Institute. His research focuses on archival ethics and research methods within the continental tradition, but his pedagogical work focuses on introducing students to suppressed philosophical traditions while simultaneously making research material in those areas more accessible to scholars. William will be sharing with us his work titled Making Visible a History of Epistemological Violence, Transcribing Primary Archival Sources on Minority Philosophy. Next, we will have the participation of Ankita Sharma. Ankita is a PhD research scholar in the English department at GGS Indraprastha University, Delhi, India. She holds a master's degree in English from the University of Delhi. Her current research focuses on the study of memory and gender in the works of select contemporary fiction by women authors. She is an alumna member of Udayan Care, an NGO promoting women empowerment through education and mentoring for young girls in India. Ankita will be sharing with us her work titled How Dark is My Future? Reading the Future of Black Girls Through Memory in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Finally, we will have the participation of Edward Ortiz Valencia. Edward is a teacher of philosophy and he is a master's degree candidate at the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar in cultural studies with an emphasis on gender perspectives in Quito, Ecuador. His current research focuses on intersexuality and current literature. He is a delegate of the program Global Youth Advancement Summit at Michigan State University for his communitarian work in Cali, Colombia. Edward will be sharing with us his work titled From Power to Empowerment, Eruptions in the Logic of Power from the Leadership of Francia Márquez Mina in Colombia. With that, I ask that you give your full attention to our panelists and help me in welcoming Marissa Knaak to the stage. Marissa, if you're ready, please go ahead.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here on this wonderful Saturday morning. As Carla said, my presentation is called Consistent Radicalism, Lucy Parsons' Anarchism. Lucy Parsons was one of the most significant anarchists in late 19th century American politics. Her anarchism was directly influenced by her life in Chicago during the 1870s and 1880s, and it remained remarkably consistent until her withdrawal from public activism in the 1910s. The three pillars on which Parsons' anarchism were built are an emphasis on the freedoms of speech and assembly, the uses of violence and violent language, and an anti-government stance. In addition to the consistency of her radicalism, a few of Parsons' main ideas remain central to radical challenges to American society. Lucy Parsons was born as a slave in the 1850s and spent most of the first 20 years of her life in Texas. Lucy, her mother, and her brother gained their freedom in the mid-1860s. But most of the details of her early life are unknown, both because written records do not exist and because Lucy herself muddied the details during the Haymarket trial of the 1880s. By 1874, Lucy had married Albert Parsons and they'd moved to Chicago. Almost immediately, the Parsons became involved in working class circles and union movements, specifically among the German immigrant community in which they lived. In the early 1880s, the Parsons were founding members of the anarchist organization, the International Working People's Association, or IWPA. Over time, Lucy and Albert became prominent anarchist speakers in Chicago, and most of their income came from anarchist organizations, publications, and speaking events. Throughout the 1870s and early 1880s, unrest between workers, capitalists, and government officials was common, especially in Chicago. Often, strikes ended in violence perpetrated by private forces employed by capitalists or by police and militias, which were urged to intervene by capitalists. The climax came in May 1886 with the Haymarket bombing. During the evening of May 4th at a labor demonstration, Albert was called upon to speak. Shortly after, someone threw a bomb. The police, who had turned out in force despite a peaceful crowd, used this as an excuse to fire into that crowd. Ultimately, the violence resulted in 7 dead police officers, 4 dead civilians, and 67 others injured. The exact events of the night of the bombing remain contested, and the bomber was never identified, but 8 men, including Albert Parsons, were arrested in connection with the death of a police officer. Lucy Parsons was outspoken in her defense of the arrested men and her condemnation of the police in the judicial process. During this period, Parsons created multiple stories of her past and her family's origins, which provide the majority of the written records of her early life. Following the Haymarket affair, many American anarchists distanced themselves from violent methods while remaining anti-government. By the early 20th century, anarchism had become associated with Emma Goldman and the idea of free love. And after the Russian Revolution in 1917, communism occupied the place early anarchism had in American society. Lucy Parsons rejected all of these changes. As mentioned, her anarchism had a consistent core and praxis from the 1870s until the 1910s. These ideas intertwine with each other, and frequently the benefits of one idea or approach conflict with those of another. First, Lucy Parsons' rejection of the government, especially voting, which was one of her longest standing positions. Central to this is her belief that the inadequacy of elected officials, federal, state, or local, to effect change in the lives of the working classes. The origin of this position relates to Albert's inability to be elected to public office in Chicago, the broken promises of those elected to office, and the influence of Johann Most, a German anarchist who immigrated to the US after splitting with German socialists over parliamentarianism. Ultimately, Parsons did not believe that voting could end the oppressive structure of society and was, therefore, a waste of time. The main impediment for voting to effect change was the presence of money in politics. In The Ballot Humbug, an article from 1905, Parsons wrote, quote, "The fact is money and not votes is what rules the people. And the capitalists no longer care to buy the voters, they simply buy the servants after they have been elected to serve," end quote. This is an idea that could have been pulled directly from a 21st century critique of American campaign finance regulations. The downside to this position is that the capitalists clearly have no qualms buying elections and elected officials, which almost guarantees laws and policies that will benefit them, including the use of force against workers and citizens striking, marching, or assembling. Practical considerations for the logical conclusions of Parsons' stance, admirable though it is, are not just relevant here in the discussion of voting. For example, Parsons rejected the aims of organizations like the Industrial Workers of the World, which combined political struggle with economic struggle in order to change the system Parsons critiqued. In addition to anti-voting and anti-political organizing, Parsons also criticized the judicial process. She condemned the Haymarket trial as it happened, but also used it as a future example of the miscarriage of justice. In 1905, she drew connections between the Haymarket trial and the trial of 3 labor organizers, Charles Moyer, William Haywood, and George Pettibone, for the murder of Frank Steunenberg, a former governor of Idaho. These men were also not the actual perpetrators of the crime, but were tried for conspiracy. The outcome this time was different. 2 of the men were acquitted, and the charges against the 3rd were dropped. In a 1907 article appearing shortly after the trial, Parsons outlined what she thought to be the main differences: a strong legal defense and the ability to present the organizers' case to the media. These differences prevented the government from running roughshod over the rights of citizens, as they had done in the Haymarket case. The second core component of Parsons' anarchism was a commitment to violence, which further complicates the messy relationship between pragmatism and principle evident in the previous section. This commitment similarly lasted from the late 1870s until the 1910s, despite Albert's conviction and execution in the late 1880s. Both Parsons used violent language, and there's some discussion over whether they meant to inspire acts of violence or merely to shock both their working class audience and their police/capitalist audience. One thing is clear though, violent language has the ability to captivate audiences and illustrate dire conditions. Initially, general anarchist calls for violence were based in self-defense. This claim in the 1870s makes some sense because strikers had been met with increasing violence. In particular, during the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, organized labor was met with a combination of police, militia, or federal troops across the country. The violence only increased as time passed. One of Lucy Parsons' first calls for individuals to use dynamite against capitalists was in 1884. Parsons wrote "A Word to Tramps" in the Alarm, the IWPA's only English language newspaper at the time. The majority of the article was concerned with showing tramps and other impoverished workers their condition was the fault of capitalism. She said, quote, "Can you not see that it is the industrial system and not the boss which must be changed?" End quote. She further asked her readers to see the larger picture, that vagrancy and unemployment were not due to market conditions or the practices of individual bad employers, but rather the fault of the entire economic structure. She concludes by saying, "Learn the use of explosives. Explosives, especially dynamite, became the weapon with which individual workers could strike decisive blows against the capitalists and the capitalist system." By the middle of the 1880s, then, the calls for violence were less about self-defense and more about taking clear, decisive actions to undermine capitalism. It is unclear to what extent the Chicago anarchists thought about the results of their calls to violence. Perhaps the anarchists, Lucy Parsons included, were merely staking out a position to differentiate themselves in a crowded field of labor organizers. Perhaps they did not consider the effects of violent speech. Ultimately, it would not matter how calls for violence were used, only that they were used, when the men tried and convicted for the Haymarket bombing did not include the actual bomber. Lucy suffered consequences as well, but remained committed to using violent language in her speeches well into the 20th century. This became problematic, however, as time progressed. In the immediate aftermath of the Haymarket bombing and trial, most Chicago anarchists stopped using violent language and retracted some of their earlier comments, including Albert and Lucy's friend, Lizzie Swank Holmes. It is unclear why Lucy Parsons did not follow their lead. In any case, she did not. Her continued violent rhetoric increased police presence in her life and potentially harmed her husband's case. In addition to how ill-advised violent language was while Albert was in prison waiting to be executed, global events around the turn of the century made violent anarchism more dangerous and distrusted among common audiences. Parsons' retreat from violent language around the turn of the century was uncoordinated. She maintained her place as an anarchist leader without advocating for anarchists who committed individual acts of violence, notably Leon Czolgosz and Lazarus Averbuch. Perhaps Parsons was stuck in a specific violent rhetorical style, rather than maintaining an ongoing commitment to physical uses of violence. Parsons' experiences with the police sharpened her advocacy of the freedoms of speech and assembly guaranteed in the First Amendment, the third main component of her anarchism. Often, police or city officials would shut down anarchist meetings or speeches based on the potential for violence or unrest. This became almost commonplace after the Haymarket bombing. Parsons embarked on a speaking tour in the late 1880s and early 1890s to raise defense funds for the accused. And in addition to being shut out of venues, Parsons was subject to police surveillance and multiple arrests. An additional element here is her commitment to the freedom of press, specifically the radical press as an oppositional force to mainstream news organizations, which catered to capitalists and their cronies. She was a frequent contributor and editor to anarchist and radical newspapers, including The Alarm, The Liberator, Firebrand, Agitator, and Demonstrator. Each of these almost constantly struggled to find financial support, and radical newspapers were never stable organizations and continually faced opposition on all fronts. This contrasts to the mainstream newspapers, which, in addition to catering to capitalist audiences, refused to hire many labor organizers and activists, Albert Parsons included. Surveillance and arrest did not stop Parsons' advocacy for the freedom of anarchist and radical newspapers, nor her advocacy of violence. What had the potential to stop both were the 1917 Espionage Act and the 1918 Sedition Act, written and enforced during United States involvement in the First World War, and in 1919, the United States Supreme Court's decision to uphold both in Schenck v. United States. After this, the constitutionality of a law would depend on the clear and present danger test, a test Parsons and other late 19th century anarchists would surely have fallen afoul of, and that many anarchists, socialists, and communists did in the immediate post-war years. This is also around the time when Parsons fades from public view, unsurprisingly given she would have been almost 70 and had been working almost constantly her whole life. And American anarchism was shifting with a new generation. So, for almost half of her life, Lucy Parsons was an outspoken radical activist. Although her impact on the American radical milieu has been studied, much of the scholarly work on her has focused on her background, her ambiguous racial identity, or her relationship to Albert. However, from the early 1880s until the First World War, Parsons advocated a very specific kind of anarchism. Her radicalization within an immigrant community gave her a unique position among American progressives, socialists, and anarchists. Her long-term association with Johann Most and violent anarchism differentiate her from later anarchists like Emma Goldman. Her experiences of police surveillance and the results of the Haymarket trial greatly impacted her understanding of the relationship of government to both capitalists and laborers. Ultimately, the image of Lucy Parsons the anarchist is complicated. From her birth as a slave to her death shortly after American entry into the Second World War, Parsons witnessed a stunning amount of change within American society. Chicago itself, her adopted hometown, changed drastically during the time when Parsons was a central figure in the labor movement. Throughout this sea of change, Parsons' personal anarchism remained astonishingly consistent. Although she decreased her outspoken calls for violence, she still maintained support for violent confrontation between labor and capital. Perhaps most remarkable was her commitment to free speech and assembly. Despite the danger to herself, both physically and mentally, and the toll the radical cause took on her family, Parsons continued to speak out against the ways in which radicals were prevented from speaking and assembly, including by arrest, methods we continue to see used today to prevent protest and political organizing. Parsons' warnings about the outsized place of money in politics, as mentioned, also continue to be relevant. Her lifelong commitment to anarchism is remarkable given the shifting allegiances of many American radicals who lived at the same time. Lucy Parsons was, and is, a strong voice for workers, and she presents a vision that can still be debated and looked to a century later. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Please feel free to clap, have digital claps. And I will turn it over to William. Please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my presentation here. Okay, there we go. Hi, I'm William Parkhurst. I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of South Florida. Today, I'm presenting on a paper and also a larger project that parallels that paper. The title of this presentation is Making Visible a History of Epistemological Violence, Transcribing Primary Archival Sources on Minority Philosophy. So this project came out of the intent to sort of fuse my social justice service work, doing archival transcription, my research, which is archival, and also my pedagogy. So basically, I end up arguing here that we can integrate archival transcription of minority philosophy into coursework as a way to support a more just world and a more just academia. So to do this, I use early intersectional Black feminism as a case study for this, right? How history sort of gets erased and how perhaps we can unerase it, we can make it visible again and viable again. So just a quick note, we have quite a nice history contingent at this conference, but for a philosopher to focus on archival stuff is a little odd. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the type of work that I've done before. So focusing on bureaucratic documents relating to philosophy, here's a bureaucratic report on one of Nietzsche's courses that I found in a Swiss archive that solved a 100-year debate. We also have annotations in philosophers' personal libraries, where they often make arguments that aren't found in their published works, or notebooks. Here's an annotation in one of Schopenhauer's notebooks, or books in his personal library. There's also letters that we don't really know about that are often in personal libraries. Here's one by Foucault that I found recently. There's also lots of new texts. Here's one, alternate ending to Nietzsche's theory of eternal recurrence that are in his page proofs. It was changed like a week or two before publication. We also have presentation copies that are often pretty interesting as far as interpreting stuff. So here's Deleuze's copy of Anti-Oedipus that he gave to Foucault, where he annotates it, no, Oedipus does not exist, right? So there's lots of interesting stuff in archives that philosophers have a tendency to not look at. Let's move on to the actual work that I'm trying to do here. So when we look at the history of philosophy, the canon that's generally accepted, one of the things that you'll find is that it's a pretty drastic case study in how to do racist and sexist history. Just this history of philosophy plot that brought up on a Google Images. Every single one of them is a white man. There's just no women in the whole history. And we've been fighting back in diversifying our canon in a variety of ways. But I think we also need to take a look at the more systemic problems that are going on here. So I want to start out here with a different conception of history that we see coming not from philosophy, but from the actual archival work that's happening today. So here's a quote from Dominique Lester, who's an archivist for the Carnegie Museum of Art. She says, "You see, history is not just everything now backwards. That is something we call the past. And history is not just a catalog of events put into the right order. History, right, and this includes history, philosophy, of course, is in fact a series of strategically curated decisions that have the ability to either uplift some or silence others. So the way in which we preserve documents, make documents available, is the way we are actually writing history, and that has significant social justice aspects to it. So one of the arguments that I make in my paper is that the standard three-wave narrative of feminism ends up erasing early contributions by early intersectional feminists. So the sort of three-wave narrative holds that in the 1830s, we have the first wave that was largely concerned with women's suffrage and challenging legal oppression. We then have the second wave in the 1960s, cultural inequities that they attacked, and also inequitable gender roles for women in a patriarchal society. In the third wave, that's usually thought of as starting around the 1990s, we get a critique of the monolithic essentialism that was pretty standard for the second wave. This essentialism presupposed that women of different backgrounds had similar experiences and faced the same kinds of oppression. So third wave feminism ends up putting forward what we now call intersectionality, right? A term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And this is the idea that different aspects of our identity, such as sex, race, ability, things along those lines, different aspects of our identity intersect, and the experience of oppression differs So this is just sort of a three-way narrative of feminism that I end up challenging. This is not something that I think is particularly historically accurate, but this is what you find on like Britannica or Wikipedia or encyclopedia, things like that, or in lots of textbooks. In any case, right, it puts forward this idea that intersectionality is this sort of new idea from the 1990s. However, when we actually look at the history, we find that there's big counterexamples, particularly in early Black feminist thought surrounding the suffrage movement. Notably, Sojourner Truth, Maria Stewart, and Mary Church Terrell, right? So over 100 years before intersectionality was supposed to be a thing, they were talking about it, and it's evident in their writings. So I think in order to address this, we have to think about why. Why are these really important, really amazing thinkers not part of our philosophical canon? And why aren't we doing work on them? So I think one of the reasons that we have to address are systemic, and it's a systemic feedback loop. Ends up excluding them and research on them, as well as minority philosophers generally. So we have cases of historical marginalization. We'll talk about one of those in the case of Mary Church Terrell. And this leads to a lack of representation and exclusion from the canon, which itself leads to them not being taken seriously in academia. And this leads to no investment in minority research, which in turn leads to no scholarly resources for research. And without those sort of basic textual resources, you have no ability to actually do research. And in turn, this leads to no jobs, right? There's no Sojourner Truth chair of philosophy. So this sort of vicious feedback loop, it just gets worse and worse. So I want to address this particular aspect of this loop. And I think we can do so from integrating archival transcription into coursework. So I'll just talk about that for a moment. So in particular, for the last couple of years, I've been using this particular assignment, looking at the autobiography, detailing an erasure of Mary Church Terrell's intersectional views, conjoining that with published text, newspaper reports, and then I have students transcribe drafts of the particular, as well as other things. So in her autobiography, she talks about how she was invited to give a presentation and talk as a colored woman about colored women, and was allotted 20 minutes. And then she was invited back again, but was explicitly told that they wanted her to speak as a woman without regard to her race, without regard to the intersection of her race and gender. And that would be for a talk, The Justice of Women's Suffrage. So we end up going into the archives. These are crowdsourced archival transcription programs. This one's through the Library of Congress. And we find in the drafts that she was really frustrated with the fact that her intersectional work was being erased. In particular, when we look at the published speech, it's only 2 to 3 pages. The drafts themselves are over 56 pages. And in these drafts, the very first line of it just shows her frustration. In particular, she says, if justice for women's suffrage hadn't been assigned to me by the program committee of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, I could never, of my own free will and accord, had the courage to choose it, right? So she's basically saying they backed her into a corner. Beautifully, when we look at the drafts, she ends up subverting their orders and talking about intersectionality, just not her intersectionality, really. In any case, this is something we don't know. We didn't know before we transcribed it because we haven't been given the resources. So when we interject archival transcription into coursework, students get a variety of important things. First, they get to learn with primary documents, and archival documents are the gold standard of education. They get to engage with primary source, active archival research. They're actually producing research that's involving the author we're learning about. Also, it helps to actually solve the very problem of erasure that we're addressing, right? It helps to make these histories visible again. And lastly, it also provides the backbone for future scholarship. So there's lots of different transcription projects going on, these crowdsourced transcription projects where you create an account and you can start transcribing archival documents. So scholars can find them on Google so that when you look them up, you can Control F them, right? In the digital age, that's one of the most important things you can do to make something visible. So what do we actually need to get this beyond a small example of pedagogy? It's in establishing a sort of project for bringing archival transcription into the classroom. In particular, we need some established scholars to help identify historically ignored sources. Thankfully, they spent their whole careers doing that. So we have a lot of information already, but hopefully we'll be able to get some grants to fund established scholars who are willing to work and help with that. Also, grant funded as well, early career researchers who can actually write assignments on the collections needed for research, right? So while established scholars have a good history and a good record, early career researchers are usually at the forefront, at the cutting edge of what needs to be done. So getting them to write assignments ends up being important. And lastly, we need instructors just all over the country in philosophy and other departments to start doing this. And in order to make this a reality, I've negotiated with the US National Archives and also the State Archives of North Carolina to offer a first of its kind certificate in archival transcription. So they can actually implement these assignments. So hopefully, as one of these grants go through, we'll get a web page that can host these assignments, and then they can be introduced into your courses. So that is the end. If you're interested in participating in a project like this, or if you're interested in being an instructor and bringing archival transcription into your coursework, feel free to email me, and I'll put you on an update list for the next time we'll do a certificate program, which is free and online. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William. Thank you for that. And now I will turn it over to Ankita. Please go ahead.
Hi everybody. Thank you, William. That was a really wonderful presentation, and I think that really picks up my interest, and I think others would also be really interested to take this forward. Thank you, Carla, for introducing me. I am Ankita Sharma, and today I will be presenting my paper titled "How Dark is My Future? Reading the Future of Black Girls Through Memory in Toni Morrison's Beloved." So, memory is for the future. Can there be a bright future with dark memories of the past? Does the black of the skin entail the dark in the future too? This paper is an attempt to address this early question and raise a few more in order to understand the complex lives and narratives of African American Black females, particularly Black adolescent girls, through a critical reading of Toni Morrison's quintessential novel, Beloved. The narratives of Toni Morrison have anchored shattered Black women tangled in the quest for identity, to the thought of liberation and a meaningful life. Her writings have been the exemplar for a nuanced understanding of the suffering of racism and the endeavors for freedom. Beloved is a landmark text in the history of African American Black women and sheds light on their racialization, traumatization, and delineation in the representations of Black girls in the white imperialist imagination. Utilizing an interpretive framework with the guidance of cultural theory, cultural studies, and feminist theory, the study offers memory as a critical tool to address the gaps in the representations of young Black girls and simultaneously envision a future for them that could create a more robust ecosystem to inhabit the creative potential of the modern Black girl. So, this is an attempt to configure the image of a free Black young girl and advance its projection in the modern race thinking through the analysis of the character of Denver and her relationship with her mother, who's the protagonist, Sethe, and her sister, crawling already baby in Beloved. The revised reading into the painful journey of slavery would be helpful in revealing the repressed history that has been largely rendered as insignificant to the extent of invisibility from the point of view of the Black women subjects. The narrative of the text, which has a maze-like structure similar to the chokecherry tree inscribed on Sethe's back, keeps on growing its branches and bears witness to the experiences of slavery that burdened Sethe long after she could claim her freedom from the sweet home. She realizes that freeing yourself was one thing, claiming ownership of that free self was another. The flashback technique of storytelling allows the readers to immerse into the text for a fluid transitioning across time and space, although the text has a fixed setting in Cincinnati, Ohio. This wraps up a certain notion of timelessness and universality around the storyline, launching and transporting it to a distant imaginary future and placing it in conversation with the contemporary Afrofuturistic thrust of locating the voices of Black women at the periphery, demanding a place at the center, and speculating a transformative future for them. Afrofuturism today is a potential cultural movement laying out a trajectory for cultural production by people of color to proliferate and flourish, blending into its contours, imagination, and future. This enables the silent gaps in the past, filled with violence, terror, and abuse, to be replaced and substituted with narratives of revision, to function and warrant the existence of a space that offers multiple identities for the Black community. Although the term Afrofuturism, which is marked by Mark Derry in his 1993 essay, Black to the Future, has expanded only recently to include more genres into its ambit, the presence of fantasy and horror have been central in the speculation of Black futures by the futurists. Accordingly, Beloved offers a site for speculating and exploring the lives of Denver and her mother, Sethe, who is sharing the haunted house, which is haunted by the memories of the ghost of a dead child. Escaping the plantation in Kentucky, Sethe had carefully stashed away the evil memories of her experiences of slavery as a young girl at Sweet Home, and later the dreadful journey to the house of her mother-in-law at 124 Bluestone. She comes at the house with a full belly to never look at her children again because it was painful to remember. But Denver and later Beloved, the troubled ghost of the daughter that Sethe killed herself, become her rememory for the disremembered truths of her past life, and with renewed interest each time peers through the most complex and hidden parts of her life that made her ache. The mysterious house with red light warnings housed the two sisters who could not find society for themselves, as one had to be killed to be kept safe, and the other one had to live without any friendly company, spending most of her time in her green retreat. Sethe mentions that The first daughter had to be killed because if I hadn't killed her, she would have died, and that is something I could not bear to happen to her. Yet Sethe could not barricade her daughters from her own troublesome past of the sweet home, as it kept reiterating itself at the Blue Stone and also dragged the two young girls into it, endangering their imagination of a sweet future. Sethe's victimization through the rememory of slavery and its internalization taints most of her relationships, and her fate confronts all Ella's caution to love anything that much was dangerous, especially if it was her children. The blissful infancy of all three of them is degenerated in the process. And so is the future? Question mark. The young girl beloved, who returns mysteriously after death to her mother, is the embodiment of the loss and deaths in the slave heritage, and her ghostly return emblematizes the psychological hurt and the wounds of loss, shame, and terror inscribed in the lives of women of color that kept disrupting the lives of those who survived. The one memory of beloved that Sethe remembered clearly was the red of the blood on her body when she dies. Other happy memories were all mixed with the painful memories and were loaded with sorrow. Beloved was the reincarnation of the desire of a child for the mother to possess her and also punish her for sending her away to a place where she can't meet her mother. This desire takes the shape of a harrowing hunger that devours Sethe. As the bigger the beloved got, the smaller Sethe became. And she, at the end of the novel, is crippled almost like her mother-in-law, baby Suggs, losing all the interest in life. In a way, this can be seen as a selfish act of revenge by beloved, who attempts to assign a similar fate to her mother as once Sethe did, hoping to reunite with her mother through death. As a result, Sethe plummets into an oblivious hopelessness, and there is an ambiguity in her last words in the novel that end with a question mark. Sethe struggled from slavery as an adolescent slave girl working at a plantation, then a difficult mother as a motherhood, a difficult motherhood as a single mother, working hard to protect her children from the vicious forces of slavery and racism, and her re-memory of the past that she closeted off to secure a blissful future for her little girl. This drains her of all the hope by the end of the novel, and she is trapped in balancing between her past and her present. While Sethe and Poldi always drifted apart from the past, Baby Suggs preached them, quote unquote, to love your heart and laying down the past. But Sethe could never put that past aside completely, and in place of putting away the memory of her enslavement and a hard motherhood, she locked herself with the past in a room, thinking that she could have the world in this room, having all there is and all there needs to be at her disposal. Denver, the solitary thinker, symbolizes all the survivors of slavery, and the infant mother relationship portrays the pre-Oedipal bond of love and desire between a mother and her child. Only she, of all the female characters in the novel, could move away from the past, however enduring it appeared to her, despite all the pain involved in the confrontation, to recover herself and build a cohesive narrative of survival that restored the balance between her past and the future waiting ahead of her. She too, like her beloved sister, derived unexpected pleasure in the stories of her mother's slavery and her birth, quote, for her brain was not interested in the future, loaded with the past and hungry for more, it left no room to imagine, let alone plan for the next day, unquote. But her emergence out of her dependence on Sethe, beloved, the confined and familiar space of the house, and her own solitary enclosure marked the crossing over that edge to assimilate into the community and laid way for an emancipated future for her. Like Paul D, who was also able to retrieve the lost red heart in place of the tobacco tin buried in his chest. By learning to recuperate from the past with the support system of the community, rather than seeking the comfort in one person like Sethe and Beloved. Denver shows the courage to make a space for her own when she resorted in the refuge of the greenhouse to gather her thoughts and channel her emotions. Later again, her first foray into the community at Lady Jones' schoolroom at the age of 7 marked the beginning of her battle for liberation and gaining control over her own life. She is intuitive to read through the plans of the ghost at 124 Bluestone and realize that the intertwining of the identities of Sethe and Beloved are going to consume her mother and would result in trapping her outside time to a quote-unquote no place. Putting her own fascination with the face of Beloved and the emotional outburst for failing at repeated attempts to find a friend in it aside, Denver could never really hate Beloved, but soon shifts her focus to her own resurgence and forges a path out of her own yard where her resentment does not obstruct her growth and learning, and she gets the nurturance and support of the Black community. She is able to find the support of women of the community who inaugurated her life in the world as a woman, and gains a paying role and acquires friends and skills such as reading. Denver thus takes control over her own narrative. It is this, similarly, in this way, the regained confidence and the possibility of hope and survival is also represented when Paul D encourages Sethe to find the pieces of her fragmented self and build herself anew, as he says, "We got more yesterday than anybody. We need some kind of tomorrow." It is this tomorrow that we are always looking forward to. And to say this, there is no escaping from past or locking away the painful memories of yesterday. But instead, there is a pressing exigency for the reinvention in the approach to, okay, I would just sum it up. So, as Amy Denver remarks, can't nothing heal without pain? The understanding of the complicit grasp of the thread binding the past, present, and the future relies on the ability to acknowledge the wounds of the past and heal them with the reality of today. This lingering past that haunts us and the prolonged desire of dwelling into it endangers the harmony of the future. The psychological scars the past has cleaved in the skin are not to be celebrated for their existence as evidence, but to be soothed by the strategic intervention into the rememory of the past with all its smooth and rough edges, to patch it up for functioning in the present and a possible future. Sethe's last words are not indicative of her utter failure and are full of positive ambiguity. And Morrison writes, "You don't end a story in the oral tradition. You can have the little message at the end, your little moral, but the ambiguity is deliberate. This ambiguity is layered and rife with sweet possibilities for the regeneration of past into potential narratives of liberation and expression, extending their meanings with fresher perspectives and varying contexts." Thank you.
Thank you, Ankita. Thank you for that. And now I will turn it to Edward, who's already with us. Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Carla, for introducing me. And thank you to the previous panelists for the documents. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second. Okay. From power to empowerment, eruptions in the logic of power from the literature of Francia Marquez Mina in Colombia. The eruptions mark the emergence of something not expected, not foreseen, of something that was not in the social, historical, economic, and environmental script. The leader, activist, and politician Francia Marquez Mina represents the most obvious forms of what I call eruptions. She has the ability to put in suspense any state of things that we consciously or unconsciously take for true in our social state of life, role of law, in our culture, and in our system of masculine, white, and dominant gender in front of the mistakenly called minorities. The definition of the term erosions emphasizes, quote, violent and sudden appearance of something, end of quote. Francia Marquez, a Black woman who was born in the remote village of Yolombo in the Cauca department, who in 2018 won the Goldman Environmental Prize, can be understood as a woman of eruptions. But who is Francia Marquez? She is the woman who, along with other courageous women from her community, protested and stopped the deviation of the Rio Ovejas in 2014, acted by illegal mining. She's also the one who, in the same year, walked with 80 women from the Cauca department to the capital, raising their voices in protest against the silent government sponsorship. She's also the woman who had to be displaced from her village due to the threats from groups outside of the law, due to the achievements that she was obtaining together with the women of the community in the face of the eradication of illegal mining. Although the definition of erosion, according to the violent and sudden appearance of something, raises alarms about the emergence of unexpected actions that affect the status quo of a society anesthetized by the demagoguery of corruption. We can ask ourselves the actions and omissions of Colombian state in the face of the contamination and exploitation of the Ovejas River and the damage caused to the communities that have inhabited and cared for it since the dawn of the conquest processes in the colonized territories of Latin America, when the Black and indigenous community have been left at the mercy of the colonizing power for the wishes of God. Now transnational God is not violent itself. Thus, the intersection of these erosions, one in particular is highlighted, and that is Francia Marquez, a woman, a black woman from an impoverished rural community, who today is a woman who causes noise in the political scenarios due to her political stances, her activism, and her empowerment as a woman supported by her community. But how can we define and understand Francia Marquez's eruptions as actions contrary to any type of violence? Francia tells us in an interview with Robert Valencia, quote, "I'm clear that my commitment is to take care of life, the territory, and to fight against structural racism. My bet is to fight against violence against women and, in this sense, it is opposed to a policy of death with an economic model of development that uses racism as a way to maintain its white supremacy," end of quote. The foundation of what we call erosions in Francia Marquez is in the fight in the care of life, the care of the territory, the fight against the structural racism, which, quote, contributes to higher levels of illiteracy and fewer opportunities for Black women to access and remain in the educational system. Then we have that 40.7% of Black women between the ages of 15 and 24 are out of the educational system. Against, as well, the violence against women and the development models sponsored by the national government and by material and symbolic constructions celebrated in the expropriation of territories and the murder of 152 social leaders and defenders of human rights so far in 2020. We wonder then, what happened to the territories recognized for Black communities in Law 17 of 1993? The regulation says, quote, The purpose of this law is to recognize the Black communities that have been occupying uncultivated land in the rural areas bordering the rivers of the Pacific according to their traditional production practices, the right to collective property. It also aims to establish mechanisms for the protection of the cultural identity and the rights of the Black communities of Colombia as an ethnic group, and the promotion of their economic and social development in order to guarantee that these communities obtain real conditions of equal opportunities compared to the rest of the Colombian society. And of course, in fact, Francio Marquez's perspective is included in a defined social power strategy that she calls, quotes, white supremacy, a category of power that, from the colonial and post-colonial stories, has driven forwards the situation of Black or Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities since the successive conquest, and has become the political, social, and economical basis of impoverishment in Colombia and Latin America. By the way, Aníbal Quijano, in reference to the globalization practices of current markets, tells us, quote, the ongoing globalization is firstly the culmination of a process that began with the Constitution of American and that of colonial, modern, and Euro-centered capitalism as a new model of world power, end of quote. Thus, the data of the forms of slavery are perpetuated in the most specialized forms of social and economic advance on the back of the fracture of the coexistence of Black and indigenous populations with their territories, their worldviews, and their constitutive practices. Lorena Osa, in her work, Poor and Black Women, Triple Discrimination 2015, points out what modernity has meant as a period that geographically universalized the West and built a principle that nominalizes the notion of development and racial detriment and territorial usurpation. She tells us, quote, today we are witnessing the establishment of a new social paradigm, part of the critique of the universality of modernity, which expropriated from others their ability to self-represent and their resources, end of quote. If today we are witnessing a new social paradigm critical to the hegemonic power system exercised over Black and indigenous communities, it is because the eruptions of actions of many women have become a dissident alternative to the social establishment. Francia specifies it by highlighting the negative demands of economic development in front of communities and leaders when she wants, quote, many of the pressures that the communities have in their territories with their leaders in the face of economic development policies have to do with these developed countries. For example, the United States is responsible for what happens to us as leaders. Europe is responsible for what happens to us leaders in these territories because a large part of these multinational companies come from those places, end of quote. However, the recognition of a matrix of pressures in the name of progress highlights the ways in which power has been installed in the territories and the life of communities, just like that of Francio Marquez, makes evident the decisive role they have played to carry out a resistance. Although the historical exclusion of women, of Black women, and together with it, the exploitation that communities such as Francio Marquez have historically been subjected to due to extractivism and gold, we understand that there is a category of power that undermines Black and indigenous communities in Colombia. This category of power can be interpreted with Francio Marquez from the perspective that reveals the situation of groups considered inferiors, when she refers to, quote, the exploitation of groups considered inferior by the hegemonic power, as is the case of Afro-descendant women. End of quote. Empowerment. Although it is not a secret that the current forms of discrimination have a genealogy that has been perpetuated through forms of racial, sexual, economic, ethnic, and territorial exclusion fostered by white and foreign power in a way of for discourses of recognition and inclusive discourses. What is put in evidence is the dependence of hierarchies and colonial forms powers, readapted to the miseries deliberately built in the territories. Aníbal Quijano tells us, quote, to the extent that the social relations that were being configured were relations of domination, such identities were associated with the corresponding hierarchies, places, and social roles as constitutive of them, and consequently, the model of colonial domination that was imposed. The role of women, the role of Black women, and the role of women in rural areas mark what can be interpreted as, quote, multiple forms of discrimination that are interconnected with gender discrimination and deepen it, causing depth tight in the life of Afro-descendant women in the different contexts of Latin America and the Caribbean. End of quote. It can be said then that the negative experiences of women and their community which have governed their lives and experiences of women and their community which have governed their lives on behalf of the community plundered by illegal mining, state oblivion, and re-victimization that they carry as marks and inventory of discrimination that does not endure, inferring that the characteristic of the hegemonic power is to re-victimize, as when the Colombian state indicates that the community of Francia Marquez is, quote, disturbers in bad faith for its actions that break logic of the white and patriarchal power of the state. We can anticipate then that the empowerment of Francia Marquez and the women of her community arises, among other reasons, from the importance of recognizing that there is a social, political, and cultural system that undermines the life of uprooted women, quote, since 1636, which is when Francia Marquez recognizes that their ancestors were brought into slavery, end of quote. Contrary to the hegemonic power, Francia observes in the need to make known, to make visible its struggles, a great empowerment strategy that breaks the logic of institutional white and patriarchal power. She tells us, we want these stories to be known because they are the same stories that I have lived, stories of work from a very young age, stories of sexual abuse from a very young age, stories of domestic work in a condition of slavery, and that sometimes make us feel that it's normal and natural until one begins to know the rights as a human being, as a woman, as an Afro-descendant. For one to understand that this is not normal, one sometimes has to do those political training processes, end of quote. The political training or empowerment that Francia Marquez proposes is built from the fight against the paramilitary groups that have been present in the territory from 1990 onwards. It also built from the fact that from 1996, 1997, they began to deliver many exploitation titles after the dismantling of paramilitary structures. And it's built from national knowledge of the presence of companies such as Anglo-Gaul Ashanti and Cosigo resources in the national territory. In this sense, for the environmental and political activism from Francia Marquez, it is clear that, quote, power lies not only in the ability of men to mobilize material resources from a variety of sources in order to advance their individual and gender interests, but also in their ability to establish rules of game in such a way that hides the way in which power works, conferring an illusion of consensus and complementarity. In conclusion, the empowerment promoted by Francia Marquez is not built on individual interests and promises of development, nor from colonial power. The erosion occurs as empowerment strategies in which there is a historical claim to freedom. The empowerment is built from the construction of identity, the construction of retrospective meanings in tune with the values and vibrations of the community, protecting the river, walking through Colombia, resisting the attack with explosives and weapons on May 4, 2019, are the effects of the standing that, to finish, well, the last quote. Identity as a historical and relational process has symbolic meanings capable of powerfully mobilizing the groups it defines, changing interests and belongings, and operating on a range of recognizable identifications, religiousness, traditional cultures, food, language, clothing, that together produces affective and personalized loyalties. In this sense, we observe that empowerment of Franco Marquez and her community contrast with the hierarchical, vertical, and centralized logics of power, with a type of relationship that starts from collective care, solidarity, working together, identifying the territory as the foundation and inheritance of new generations. It celebrates the environmental not as a natural asset, but as one more being among the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. And I take this opportunity to thank all our panelists for these great, insightful presentations. And so with that, we will go ahead and take some time for our Q&A sections. You can either unmute yourself and address directly to our panelists, or you can use you can type on your questions on the chat box as you feel more comfortable with. Panelists are also invited to make questions to other panelists as well. Yes, please, Anna, go ahead.
So I had a question. I had lots of questions, and I really enjoyed the sort of, I just throughout the whole conference, these really great intersections. But my question for now, at least, was to Edouard. I'm a US historian. It's not a very informed question. It's more that I was interested in the community that Francia Marquez comes from. I don't know, is it a community that is predominantly Afro-Colombian, like the town where this mining is happening, or is it sort of also indigenous and sort of like, I just wondered about, because you were talking about this empowerment coming from the community and this walk through Colombia, right? And I just I was interested in sort of, I guess, like more about what that kind of community was. And so Marquez's place as like Afro-Colombian woman within that community, how that played out.
Thank you, Anna, for your highlight. Yes, this community is like a melting pot of many situations. Predominantly is a Afro-Colombian community that for different reasons, and speaking about displacement, and speaking about civil wars, illegal activities, corruption too, many people end up over there. So the strategy from this community has been trying to improve, trying to deepen real connections in contrary to the logical power that undermines the life of those communities, because it is not secret that the government knows about those kind of problems, but the community is living in so serious problem over there. So they have to take, they have to resolve with these problems, making these kinds of actions from community, from solidarity, from that kind of bonds together, walking, celebrating cultural rituals too, many things. So there is a melting pot. Thank you.
We have a question for William in the chat. Have you had interactions with archivists and librarians that have helped you? And just wondering if you can speak a little bit of this. It's from Sam.
to unmute. With this particular project, I've worked with, so far, in order to establish the archival certification, I worked with several archivists who led our first training sessions on archival transcription. So they helped in that way for this project. I've also done several archival fellowships for my own research in continental philosophy. I'm able to talk to several archivists based on that. That was unrelated to social justice work. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it was answered. Please feel free, as I said, to unmute yourself and address even between you panelists. I can start saying something additional, that I've noticed that among all the 4 panelists, you have been working on unveiling leadership. And I would like to know your opinion on how this work will impact future leaders and future researchers.
I can jump in on this a little bit, and Scott also put a question in the chat. But part of my project was thinking about how there's similarities across time, so that the narratives we see a lot in current activism in the United States about the justice system and miscarriages of justice, or the place of money in politics, but anchoring that in a longer tradition of critiquing the American system, I think it's very helpful. So it doesn't just feel like new movements come out of nowhere, because we know that they don't. So taking that into account is one of my general projects. Then if I could answer Scott's question, the different narratives about Lucy Parsons, most of them focus on her as the wife of Albert Parsons, or as sort of an activist with an ambiguous racial identity, which is sort of more interesting to a lot of people than sticking in terms of theory and what theory does for people and how that's actually important. There have been a couple biographies. One really excellent one came out in the last 10 years by Jacqueline Jones. It's called Goddess of Anarchy. And it uses a lot of earlier sources, biographies, and puts it as Lucy Parsons, a full person, not Lucy Parsons, the wife of a Haymarket bomber. So I built a lot off of her work, but I also used a compilation of primary sources, which was excellent because I couldn't get to an archives in the short amount of time I had to work on this project, and transportation being difficult. So building off of those, but looking at Lucy in a different way. I think similar to how William's looking at philosophy and history of philosophy in different ways, so that it's not just women as this one thing, but as more complex, and allowing them to be complex and all of that. Scott, I hope that answers your question.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I have a question to William. William, I was thinking about your presentation and asking myself, what could be the strategies for trying to unearth or construct a kind of philosophy, maybe a philosophical feminism, or maybe feminism with a characteristic, with a philosophical perspective. Because when you have to face, for example, that kind of construction that are the result of a history of men, you find so few women, but there are a lot. Yes, and so my question is, what is that? What is a strategy for trying to give voice to that, to those voiceless women. Yes, something like that. Sorry for my tangling.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different strategies, right? The little diagram of the history of philosophy, right, is just the canon that we end up teaching. That's not the actual history of philosophy, right? Women have been involved in philosophy since ancient Greece. It's just that they've never been given credit. So there's a lot of different projects that are trying to critique the history of philosophy and reconstruct it in a more historically accurate way. That includes women, you know, disabled philosophers, trans philosophers. For example, there's a project that I'm involved with from an early career researcher in it out of Canada called the New Narratives in Philosophy. And what it does is it brings together young scholars who are interested in critiquing and reconstructing the philosophical views of those who have been excluded from the canon. Now, I think one of the central problems of that and the whole effort is that because philosophy has been historically just racist and sexist, we don't have a very good representation of views in philosophy, right? So a lot of times you have to pull in voices that fled philosophy, right? That go to anthropology, that go to rhetoric, that go to literature, right? Because if you're not a white man in philosophy, sorry to say this, but your world is just going to be way harder. So from my perspective, I think we need to do everything we can to fix that, because it's just completely unacceptable.
I think I'd like to add something to that. So what William just mentioned, I think memory studies is also a booming area where, you know, a rereading practice is being initiated. And as we are talking about the canon, there are texts that have been crucial landmarks in making the movements work. And there are very important texts that have been left out of those without making any mark. And memory scholars, they are actually encouraging this rereading practice from that perspective. So that also brings in kind of an erasure that highlights the erasure of the history, which, you know, just focuses on the men's version and strategically erases women out of the history. So I think memory is also doing great work over there.
Can I also just respond to Ankita's comment, because I think that's so fascinating, because Taya Miles, in her Ties That Bind, which is a historical work about Cherokee slaveholding, she uses Beloved because there are so few sources on sort of, she does use Harriet Jacobs, but who I think could be read also as like a philosophy text, right? But also as a historical text and a literary text. But she uses Beloved to sort of think about motherhood and enslavement, because there are so few sources that directly address that. And so it's sort of to find, and a lot of historians, I think, are very kind of anxious about that, right? Because she's a contemporary writer. And so to then say, well, can she understand 19th century perspectives? But it's sort of, I was thinking about that as I was listening to your paper, and how, and sort of in connection to Williams, and sort of thinking about how, yeah, sort of we can find these in sort of important texts and use them in sort of important ways that maybe, you know, if we sort of remain sort of narrowly disciplinary, we might not.
Do we have additional questions or comments that you would like to share?
I've got a question just for the other panelists that just came up. But to what extent do the other panelists feel that this sort of reapproach history has to be interdisciplinary? I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how social justice work should or shouldn't be interdisciplinary.
I think that it ends up being interdisciplinary just because of what it aims to do. And the idea of doing academic work as sort of the social justice praxis doesn't come out of one place. So there's a lot of sort of interconnections and bridges being built that just, if you believe that social justice is a thing we should be working towards as academics, then you're going to be searching for it wherever you can find it.
Please go ahead.
Yes, there is a great question, so reflexive question. I think that right now we are rethinking many concepts, many very broad concepts, and it requires to making a lot of interconnections, make like a night for intertwine many categories, and most of that aren't much experiences, because sometimes I feel that, for example, in the philosophical and in classic, the sociological work is sometimes like a little distance with those realities. So for that reason, I consider that it is too necessary to hear those kind of narratives, those kind of heightened concepts, maybe. I think that is necessary, a kind of hermeneutical attitude for trying to give voice to those issues, to those insights. That is a so thoughtful question.
I'm going to go back to my leadership questions, if you allow me. I wanted to ask Edward, I'm listening about Francia and how she's basing her leadership on this community approach. How is she managing to form or other leaders in her community?
Teresa, thank you for that question. In fact, when I was doing this presentation, I felt the need to connect with other women into the territory. So unfortunately, I couldn't connect with them because they have so full agenda. But I think that I'm going to continue with these projects because there are so many stories and there are so many women who is trying to open a path to continue. If you look, for example, Francia Marquez got a special prize, the Gobind Prize. She is under the spotlight. But what's happening with the rest of women? Yes, and she always recognizes those women because she's always speaking on behalf of the community. The community is in front always in her speech. So there are a lot of community here, women, especially women who are working with those communities in those areas front the countryside that has many problems. Yes, I mentioned, for example, the reaggregation of illegal and violent groups. Yes, because they don't agree with that kind of manifestations that stops in some percentage, the actions of the multinationals that are coming here for gold. But there are a lot and many stories, yes, unknown stories.
Thank you.
I'm asking a lot of questions, but I did have one for Marissa. And it kind of relates to the leadership because I really did not know about Lucy Parsons much at all. And I didn't get to write down the book you mentioned, but I want to read that and look into it more. But I had the one I know her about through Albert Parsons, but also I thought she was a founder of the IWW. And you mentioned that she wasn't really kind of like, so I was sitting in that side going, oh, I'm not sure how to put those two things together, because you mentioned something about her not being really kind of on board, but I was like, the one thing I know about her is I thought she was one of the founding members of the IWW. So I was trying to put those two things together.
Yeah, she's a bit tricky. I dropped the biography in the chat. She's at the founding meeting of the IWW and she speaks to it, but she never actually joins the IWW. And she sort of likes the American communists, but she never joins them because she doesn't agree with political organizing, which blows my mind because then the capitalists should get more power. But she's very consistent about it. So she says, you know, elections are rigged and stupid in the 1880s. She refuses to join the IWW in like 1905, and then she just doesn't give up on it ever. So yeah, she's there and she talks to these people, like William Haywood's one of the IWW people. So it's the same group of people, but she thinks they're barking up the wrong tree with political organizing.
So I had another quick question for Marissa, if that's okay. So at one point in your talk, you talked about how Lucy sort of muddied her own history. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Definitely within philosophy, philosophers are oftentimes their worst biographers because they change facts about their own lives. I'm wondering if you could just expand a little bit more on how she muddied her own history.
Yeah, so during her speaking tours after the Haymarket happened and during the trial, everybody was all suddenly like super interested in the wife of one of the men arrested for the bombing. And she was born a slave, but her parentage is like kind of confusing. And she lived a lot of time in Texas. So she was able to sort of craft this past for herself where she somewhat erased her heritage as a slave and said that she had Native American ancestry or Hispanic ancestry. And it wasn't consistently the same narrative. And she would talk to reporters. And part of that, I feel like, is just she was really good at manipulating the media on some level to get them to tell the story that would keep the press going. And part of it's just she did what she did. So now everybody's like, oh, but what was her racial heritage? And it's like, that is not the interesting story, which is why I sort of glossed over it. But yeah, she did it herself, probably strategically.
We still have a couple of minutes to make additional questions. So please feel free to unmute. Or do you want to share any final thoughts as panelists to the audience, to the other panelists as well? Please feel free to do this. So. Okay. Well, it seems we have a question for William here. Oh, sorry, and I've just read this one. How have students responded to the transcription projects?
Yeah, it's been really positive. So I've done it in 3 different formats. In class, where the students, we all work on one archival document and have a shared Google document that we work on. And then once we decide as a class that it's good, we take it and put it into the crowdsourced transcription program. The students seem to enjoy that just because it's so collaborative and you get to have interesting debates about you know, whether or not that's an R or an S, and if that actually changes the content of the writing itself. I then have assignments that students do individually. So each student is assigned, say, a page to transcribe, and then in class we come together and talk about that. And also I've done it with extra credit assignments that are optional. It does seem that I want to say, demographics that respond to it in the optional extra credit seem to not be white men, but that just might be a philosophy thing. But aside from that, the students all seem to be really excited about it, because in philosophy, it's very rare, very, very rare that you're given a problem that you can actually solve. In philosophy, we talk about these questions that we've been debating for, 2,000 years. And one of the neat things about integrating archival transcription in this way is we can say, look, erasure is this huge problem in the history of philosophy. And we're going to learn about that problem, but check it out. Now we all get to do something to help actually solve it in a practical way, permanent. So the students really enjoy that. They actually get to do something that matters to solve these problems. At least for me, when I was taking lots of courses in feminism in graduate school, you read all this stuff and you teach all this stuff, but at the end of the course, you go out of the class and you go, well, I want to fucking burn something down to make a change. But all I've got is it's dumb books. So I think the students really enjoy actually being able to do something about the problems that we're addressing. As a final note for any of you who are interested, I'm just dropping my email there in the chat. If you're interested in being part of the certification that'll happen probably again next year, give me an email and I'll put you on the update list.
And we have a final question for Ankita. Can you speak a little to how you got interested in memory work and memory studies from Sam? You're muted.
Hi. So actually being a literature student, it's difficult, and people ask me this many a times, and how do you want to associate yourself with memory studies, since it's partly has always been part more of the history. But now, if you look it up, memory studies is actually expanding to include philosophical transitions into it, and literature. The contemporary literature, especially after the Black Lives Matter, there have been many stories, and the power of stories has come up like anything. And the personal stories have been given the due credit that they always had. And even when Kamala Harris won, she talked about the representation that the Black girls really would follow. The representation that she has actually shown the world. And she's actually talked about how this is going to come up for very strongly for other girls to follow. So I think this is what also influenced me. I always think that stories have the potential to talk about the things that we don't experience maybe firsthand, but then there are things that you want to know, and you can always go back and look for those personal stories and see how they confirm the official histories and how tall they do stand. And women have always been largely absent from those. So that's why I wanted to pick up stories by women.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. We have reached our time limit. It was a pleasure to be with you all today. I appreciate your presence and thank you for joining us. And I hope we see each other in a future event to exchange ideas once more. Thank you, everybody. Have a good morning or good afternoon now.